Hello, welcome to Muse Egyptology. My name is Kate and I'm an Egyptologist, and on this channel I teach you about ancient Egypt and the museums that celebrate it. Today I'm going to teach you about the basics of ancient Egyptian chronology, or rather the chronology that we use when talking about ancient Egypt. This is an important and fundamental tool so you can learn about ancient Egypt within a historical context that's easy to remember and understand. When studying the past, it's useful to have a dating system to fit things into, such as historical events and the lives of specific people, or at least a chronological framework such as the Victorian period followed by the Edwardian period in Britain, for when we don't have specific dates. Then we can understand the order in which things happened and the historical context in which things took place. We can't use the chronological system that the ancient Egyptians used because the ancient Egyptians actually based their time, their years, their dates on the reign of the current king. So when the old king died, on day one of the new king's reign, it became a brand new, fresh start. So when Amenhotep II came to the throne, it was day one, year one of his reign. It wasn't year 300 and whatever from the date of some event or the start of some king's reign. It was day one, year one. So the way that the ancient Egyptians wrote dates was, for example, day 24, first month of Peret, that was one of their seasons, year 2 of the reign of Amenhotep II. So each reign was separated from other kings' reigns. We need to know the order of the kings of ancient Egypt to be able to understand what a specific date applies to. So we need to know that, for example, Thutmose III shared a co-regency with Hatshepsut that had followed the reign of Thutmose II, that had followed the reign of Thutmose I, that had followed the reign of Amenhotep I, that had followed the reign of Ahmose. We need to know the order of the kings. And in lots of cases, we do. The problem is we don't know the order of all of the kings' reigns. There are a lot of kings we don't know much about at all, particularly during the intermediate periods and periods when there's just a lack of evidence that has made its way to us in the present day. So we can't use the ancient Egyptian dating system now as reliably as we would like. So Egyptologists have had to establish their own dating system, and that's what we'll be looking at today. So this is a timeline I have made to represent the basic time periods of ancient Egypt. So we've got all the labels of the periods, and I have to say that the widths of these individual sections are not to scale. They do not represent how long the periods lasted. So we've got the pre-dynastic period, the early dynastic period, the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, the second intermediate period, the New Kingdom, the third intermediate period, the late period, and then the Greco-Roman period. So, for example, during the Old Kingdom, it was the Pyramid Age. During the Middle Kingdom, you still had pyramids. You also had the rise of literature. And during the New Kingdom, there was a lot of empire building and foreign warfare, and a lot of famous kings like Tutankhamun, Ramesses II. You've got these intermediate periods. We'll talk about what an intermediate period is in a minute. If you're interested, I have made a video on the second intermediate period and an introduction to the New Kingdom, and I'll link that below. The Greco-Roman period was the period of the Ptolemies, and then the period in which Cleopatra committed suicide, and then Augustus took over the control of Egypt and became its Roman emperor. The pre-dynastic period was the period when Egypt hadn't been united yet. It was not yet a country, not yet a state, and this is a very formative period for ancient Egyptian culture as we perceive it now, and the early dynastic period was still quite a formative period. So this timeline covers approximately 4,700 years. It goes from approximately 4,300 BCE to 395 CE. And there is a lot of history before and after, but this is really the period in which we call it ancient Egypt, because before that Egypt wasn't a state, so it's not Egypt, although technically the pre-dynastic period wasn't a state yet. And then afterwards we're going into later periods that may not be classed as ancient. So this is the timeline of ancient Egypt. So these labels represent broad time periods, and each period is subdivided with several dynasties, which we'll talk about in a minute. Sometimes there are other subdivisions, such as the Ramesside period and the Amarna period, both taking place within the New Kingdom. So let's define these labels. These terms represent the general political situation happening throughout Egypt at those times. Kingdoms, these three here, represent times when one king at a time ruled the whole country. And intermediate periods, these three here, were times when Egypt was divided, ruled by more than one king or ruler at the same time, ruling part of Egypt each, and there were internal borders. It could be described as a time of civil war, but not the whole period was defined by battles, but certainly there were rivalries between the different rulers. So then we've got these other periods at the beginning and the end of Egyptian history. You've got the early periods, the pre-dynastic and the early dynastic, and the late period. These were perceived as periods of formation in the early times and decline in the late period. And then you've got the Greco-Roman period, ruled by the Ptolemies and then the Romans. So this system is simplistic, but it is useful, because if you can remember the characteristics and events that generally happened during the particular period, it does help put the things that you're learning about into context at a basic level. Now we've got this next slide, and what I've done here is put the dynasties that are recognised as part of these periods into the periods on the timeline under the labels of those periods. The dynasties are numbered 1 to 31. Although during this last stage of the pre-dynastic period, known as Naqada III, it's sometimes called Dynasty 0. When we say dynastic period, which is a term that you will probably hear when studying ancient Egypt, we mean the early dynastic period to the end of the late period, because this is Dynasty 1 to Dynasty 31. It doesn't tend to include the pre-dynastic period or the Greco-Roman period. So each of these kingdoms or periods is made up of between 2 and 6 dynasties. A dynasty is a period of time in which there was a sequence of kings or rulers, and they are all connected by something, usually a family relationship or the location of where they ruled from. Dynasties continued until there was some sort of break in continuity, break in this connection, such as the end of a familial line or moving the capital city or royal residence to another location. Usually, if only one of those things changed, the dynasty would continue. So, for example, Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty moved the court to his new capital city, Akhetaten, but the dynasty continued because he was the hereditary successor to the throne of his father Amenhotep III. But if both of those factors changed, it indicates a significant break from the tradition of the previous kings. So we would consider then that a new dynasty started. For example, after the death of Mentuhotep IV, a non-royal acceded the throne, Amenemhat I, and moved the capital to Ichtawi, heralding the 12th dynasty. A numbered dating system like this is convenient because it quickly indicates to you approximately when an event happened or an object dates to relative to kings' reigns and other markers. It's difficult to remember all of the kings' names and what order they came in, but if you can remember which period each dynasty happened in, you can understand the context, but it's more specific than the kingdom and period framework. So this is the third version of the ancient Egyptian chronology or timeline that I'm showing you today. It's a version where I have laid over the modern Western dating system of year numbers over the top of these periods or kingdoms. Obviously, it counts backwards and forwards from what we call year one at the beginning of the Common Era. I choose to use BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, rather than using BC and AD respectively. If you're new to studying ancient Egypt, you may want to understand the timeline of Egyptian history, or when certain events happened, by contextualising it by the years that we are familiar with. However, I rarely think about ancient Egyptian history within this Western years framework, and in fact it does confuse me. I use the kingdoms, periods and dynasties as my chronological framework, and all I need to do is understand when things happened relative to other events in ancient Egypt. For example, during the early reign of Amenemhat III, or 2 years after the Battle of Megiddo. In the study of history, learning the precise year when an event happened as a standalone fact is not actually as useful as understanding the wider context in which this event happened. So I think that the system that I use, that most Egyptologists use, works well. This timeline here is a visualization of the ancient Egyptian chronology from the University of Memphis website. It's only one version of the possible dates of ancient Egyptian history set within the framework of the modern Western dating system, as Egyptologists aren't actually certain about exactly when specific events happened, such as the unification of Egypt as a state, which would be around here, but we don't know exactly what date, or when periods started or finished. This is due to the ambiguity of some evidence and the regnal dating system producing standalone reigns with no historical context implied in the dates, and the Egyptian dates not fitting in with our Western dates perfectly. In fact, the ancient Egyptians recognised a 365-day year, but they didn't account for the extra quarter day in the Earth year as we do with leap years. So every 4 years the year was out by 1 day. Progressively, as the decades went by, the first official day of summer would be a whole season out. So we can't trust the dates that ancient Egyptian texts give us to be precise. Therefore, Egyptologists have to use alternative dating techniques such as astronomical dating and carbon-14 radioactivity dating. There will always be uncertainty and debate about dates, and 2 timelines produced based on alternative interpretations of evidence could champion different dates. Egyptologists and archaeologists are continually working on improving and refining our knowledge about when things happened in ancient Egypt. For example, we probably still don't know the names of all of the kings of the Second Intermediate Period, not to mention the lengths of their reigns and the order in which they ruled. As such, we need to be careful when trying to use Western dates for ancient Egypt, as they may not be correct. We have to be open to new evidence that could alter our understanding of when reigns or events took place, so dates such as these could change at any time. The University of Memphis website says, "The dates in this resource reflect the latest scholarship." I tried to find out when the site was last updated, but wasn't successful. But the benefit of it being a website means that it can be regularly edited when new research comes out, whereas physical books can't be unless you have access to the newest edition, which can still quickly become out of date. The timeline I used to go by in the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt book is now out of date, and it does have different dates than this one, but I can print out a copy of the University of Memphis timeline and put it in that book at least. However, be careful which website you use. The University of Memphis teaches ancient Egypt at undergraduate and graduate level, so I know their resources should be reliable. But there are a lot of websites from amateurs who could use incorrect or out-of-date sources, and AI-produced content is not 100% reliable. So look into the background of the websites, the owners, and the sources that they use before relying on these. The dynastic framework and the chronology of kingdoms and periods is not a perfect system to organise ancient Egyptian history into. Firstly, these terms, dynasties, kingdoms, periods, are not how the ancient Egyptians identified their own history. In fact, they did not group individual kings' reigns into dynasties or time periods or label them as such. The dynastic system was instead invented by an Egyptian priest called Manetho, working at the very beginning of the Ptolemaic period. So way over here on this timeline. He looked back, he studied ancient sources from the history of ancient Egypt, which was already very ancient when he came to look at it. He used sources such as king lists, and so he used this evidence to group the reigns of the kings together into different dynasties, numbering 1 to 30. Since then, Egyptologists have identified the Second Persian period at the end of the Late Period, and this has been labelled as Dynasty 31. There are a couple of problems with numbering dynasties. One is that Manetho was under the impression that all of the kings ruled successively, so he numbered the dynasties consecutively. However, it's not this simple. During the intermediate periods, there was more than one ruler at a time in different areas of Egypt, so the kings ruling the north belonged to one dynasty and the kings in the south were part of another dynasty, but both ruling at the same time. This means, for example, dynasties 16 and 17 of the Second Intermediate Period were simultaneous, not sequential, which isn't obvious from the numbering system, so it would be easy to get the wrong impression about the nature of kingship during the intermediate periods. This system left no wiggle room if a new dynasty is discovered, such as the possible Abydos dynasty of the Second Intermediate Period, which is based on the list of names of rulers from the Turin Canon, which is a king list written perhaps during the reign of Ramesses II. They come after the names of the rulers we now identify with the 16th dynasty, but are not part of the 17th dynasty Theban kings. If it's accepted that this should be a distinct group of rulers that should be identified as a dynasty, how do we label them? 16.2? 16b? Calling it something like this implies that it has some sort of relationship to the 16th dynasty, but it didn't. The kingdoms and periods framework, how they grouped dynasties together, and the labels they used, was developed and adapted over the course of approximately 120 years by a small number of 19th and 20th century European Egyptologists. It was based on the evidence for Egyptian history known across those decades when they were examining it. But more has become known more recently about ancient Egypt that may change our understanding of this time. And even if the labels we still use to talk about these periods doesn't change, our brains have to be flexible to take into account the new findings about ancient Egyptian history. When trying to fit the dynasties into the kingdoms and periods framework, or rather constructing this framework around the dynasties, the question is, how do you decide which dynasties go into which period? Who's to say that Dynasty 14, for example, fits into the Middle Kingdom and not the Second Intermediate Period? The labels and definitions of the kingdoms tend to characterise ancient Egypt by the political situation in the capital city, not the socio-political situation in the provinces, which can be different or can change at a different pace to what's happening closer to the government base. These labels imply that there was a definite and static political system, such as total power of a single king versus chaos and split, weak power of an intermediate period. But the truth is far more complicated. For example, the power of the Egyptian throne weakened over decades before an intermediate period, and men in local areas started to grow more powerful. Although the official king was still technically the ruler of the whole of Egypt, should these decades be considered part of the intermediate periods, such as Dynasty 14 that I mentioned a second ago? The groupings of dynasties and the labels kingdoms and periods reflect how these few 19th and 20th century Egyptologists characterized and classified certain periods of Egyptian history according to their judgment and opinions. For example, the kingdoms were considered a golden age, a peak time in Egyptian history with great achievements being made, whereas the intermediate period and the late period are times of crisis or decline, and the pre-dynastic period and early dynastic period are primitive. While these characterizations may be somewhat accurate from a retrospective point of view, they are broad and simplistic, single labels for a long-lasting, complex period, and such perspectives are only addressing overall political or high culture changes. They don't consider how the ancient Egyptians, commoners or elite and royals may have perceived their history, the achievements made during these so-called periods of decline, or the socio-political struggles during the great periods, or the experiences of real ancient Egyptian people. By labelling periods with one name with implied value, it threatens to affect our perceptions of these periods. For example, when characterising the intermediate periods as times of chaos or crisis, it implies that most socio-political changes that took place then were negative compared to the norms of the ancient Egyptian traditions or the civilization, which does not allow the perception that some of these changes, such as the coalescing of support around a local ruler who was independent from the king, could have been a popular or even natural evolution in politics in a state where the status quo had been in place for hundreds of years. Despite these difficulties, memorable and consistent labels for the period of ancient Egyptian history are useful and important. Until Egyptologists come up with a more flexible dating system, it will be continued to be used, with the caveat that we know it's simplistic and out of date. Those of us studying ancient Egypt will continue to work around its problems, knowing that these dynasties, labels, groupings and dates need to be supplemented by the continual learning of subtleties and intricacies of such a complex civilization. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for any engagement that you give me, any comments. Follow me on Instagram if you wish, watch my previous videos, and please subscribe. Thank you. I'll see you next time.